Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about myth. And amazingly, something we have not discussed before, although almost nothing could be more central to Jung, his process, his experiences, and his theories. So what is a myth? Well, myths are collective revelations based on unconscious psychic experience. So consciousness does not create them, and they teach us. They're teaching tales. They're very strongly aligned with the religious function culturally and individually. And they teach us that archetypal energy is supraordinate to human power. Myths are to culture what dreams are to the individual, and they provide symbols that dynamically activate the discovery of new possibilities. So we find in mythology all kinds of experiences, narrative patterns, transcendence that deal with the universals of life. Conflict, separation, love, desire, conquest, loss, redemption, and the list goes on and on. So let's take a look together this week at this vast repository of human experience and see where we go.
Well, the Roman historian Sallust is said to have written that myth never happened, but always is. So that touches on something about the eternal truth that we find in myth. And I think we all recognize that when we read mythology.
And whether we know it or not, this is how we construct reality. It is how we make meaning. We add up all our experiences, and this happened, and then that happened. He said, and I went there, and the food was, and what does it mean? We're always doing it at a superficial, everyday level, and we are doing it in terms of what is the meaning of our life. The people that we love, the careers we pursue, the travels we long to engage in, children, etc. That they are like the beams inside the walls of our houses. They're the essential structure that holds up the house and defines the house, even though they're not visible.
And Jung is the one who brought this clarity forward. I mean, myths have existed as long as human culture has, but Jung understood myths as the phenomenology of the objective psyche. And that's not a frame people were necessarily holding.
Unpack that a little bit more about the objective psyche and that reality, because it's important.
Yeah, that while we may have known, all of us, even since we were kids and learning myths in school, but questioning the place that myths come from and what they are describing is something that Jung found really interesting. So we have our waking personality, and then the early Freudians were curious about the personal unconscious material that we could know that's within reach if we hadn't forgotten it, or if we can find some way of finding a thread to it or repressed it. But it's something that's still related to our personality and our lived experience. Jung dropped another layer or several layers deeper, and he both experienced, particularly during his creative illness, as well as, once he understood it in the dreams of his analysand, that there is another layer to the unconscious, that there is a field of consciousness that all humans co-participate in that actually stores and organizes the vestigial experiences of all humanity and groups them and organizes them. Now, the Platonic idea is that all these forms existed from the beginning of time and human beings have ever been influenced by them. Sometimes Jung suggests that maybe collective human experience has co-created the structures. Maybe they were there in some metaphysical way. But that this layer of the unified psyche is active, that it has, or it is populated by structures, and that myths, particularly mythic themes that repeat throughout time and in many different cultures, suggests that there are universal elements that are active underneath all the different cultures, and that we can track how these things act and function through the study of myth.
And I do just want to insert here, that was a great summary. And you said that Jung was the first, but we need to give a little hat tip to Freud.
That's right.
Because, as early as around 1900, he was beginning to think in terms of the Oedipus complex. And I mean, it's a very interesting thing, right? Because Freud took the myth of Oedipus, who of course murdered his father and slept with his mother, and used that as a kind of central organizing idea in his understanding of the kind of development of the psychosexual stages of development. So there's pre-Oedipal, and then there's more of a kind of Oedipal sexuality. So these become really fundamental framing ideas for Freud, but he really only works with that one myth. Maybe there's another one he eventually kind of adds in there, but there isn't the sense that he's embracing mythology as a storehouse of patterns that could track the very bones of the collective unconscious. But they're mining somewhat of the same vein there. And of course, he really fully develops that idea in 1910. During some of those years, he would have been working alongside Jung. So I don't know that anyone's ever really tracked what was the mutual influence around the use of mythology in the exploration of human psychology, but they certainly would have been in touch when they were both working on those ideas.
Here's my question based on your research about this, Lisa, is that the Oedipus story is a play. I've not come across Oedipus as a myth. I mean, it comes from that Greco-Roman time period that we associate with mythology, and the theater of the Oedipus story, of course, involves mythic figures that are referenced in it. But beyond the play, Oedipus at Colonus, Oedipus Rex, etc., does that exist as a religious myth, or is that more of a vestige of the aesthetic and art of the period?
Well, I mean, I think all of the drama was myth, and myth was drama for the ancient Greeks, and I think all of those. All of the dramas were based on mythological stories. So kind of tracing it back to where is it, where does it appear? I'm not as good a scholar on that, but I think it counts as a myth. In my book, it does.
Sure. So we have the collective unconscious, we have myths, and the way that human beings can sense through their imagination these movements in the objective psyche. The other thing that's unique about myths and also fairy tales is that they survive. Because we could imagine, in the ancient world, millions of people across eons that are alive and imaginative and creative, but not everything survives from the psychology of those individuals. There's something about these religious myths that have a staying power, and that marks them as unique and distinct from perhaps other cultural products in that way. And that can also give us some confidence that there is something archetypal or structural in the story, that it sustains interest throughout time and culture.
I think we see the resurgence of these universal themes that are the myths, whether they're Norse myths or Aztec myths or Japanese myths or Greek myths. We see them all the time in every drama that we watch, every Netflix movie, the plays. I mean, think of something like how powerful a play like Death of a Salesman is. I saw it some years back, and it really gripped me as an older adult. I got it all of a sudden. Harry Potter, there it is. The stories of C.S. Lewis and Narnia and Tolkien, and these are all mythological tales. It's all around us all the time.
There are different ways of understanding what myth is, and different thinkers have brought different things to the table. Deb, I think what I would agree with is all of the stories that you just mentioned have like an archetypal taproot. I think some people would say they're mythological, and some people might not agree with that. And I don't know that I have a clear opinion, but just to kind of parse it a little bit, Jung was very interested in the tendency of the psyche to spontaneously generate mythic material, that it's almost a kind of way of thinking, as I said before. Whereas someone like, if you read Joseph Campbell, who of course was, a very famous, prominent mythologist who was very influenced by Jung, he was a little bit more down the track of seeing myths as more cultural productions that are sort of like distillates of collective wisdom, which is a very interesting way to think about myth, right? I mean, we said before, it doesn't have conscious input. It doesn't have conscious input from a single individual, but I think that myths do contain the sort of distilled collective wisdom of a culture. Myths tell us how to live. Myths help us orient to meaning. They let us know where we are in the cosmos. And that's where I'd say, well, I'm not sure Frozen is a myth. It might have like a mythological or an archetypal core. I actually never saw it.
It's really great. The music is great.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll put it on my list. But I guess my kids were just like a little too old when it came out. But if we think of like, the Norse myths or the Celtic myths or the Aztec myths, these are really associated with particular cultures, and they've been sifted down through the generations by being told and retold, and then sometimes written down by poets or playwrights or whatever. But they belong to the culture. They belong to the people.
But I think that's exactly right, that there is a common sort of very deeply collective substrate, but it shows up in myriad ways in different cultures. It's all these archetypal realities show up in all of us, and I will express certain archetypal patterns and have certain narratives that are different from yours, but the taproot is way down there, and that's what's universal. And then the tribes and cultures shape those universals as relevant to a particular culture.
Right.
So we have, it's theme and variations is really what we're talking about.
And I think Star Wars is a great example. So we have the heroic, mythic cycle in there, but in our more modern era, it's culturally informed by our fantasies around technology and robots and space travel and spaceships and also magic, which I don't know existed prior to Lucas deciding he's going to wrap it in that kind of technological fantasy. But that's a good example of the eternal mixing with the culture And also, what that does is it creates this enormous amount of energy, and that if the culturally decorated myth has enough of the archetypal element to it, it will once again vitalize the viewer, and perhaps, as Star Wars did, vitalize a culture. It becomes a cultural object because it's doing something in the collective psyche, just as you were saying, Lisa, of the culture at that time. Do all stories have mythic underpinnings? I think that we could absolutely say that. I mean, any play about a mother, the archetypal mother is part of every expression of the mother, but is it being presented in a way that conjures the archetypal intensity of it? Probably not. But some stories do, in which case more of the collective is attentive to it because there's something more universal about the way, for instance, the mother or the child or some other dominant is being presented. So it's that mysterious thing about the archetypal image versus all other kinds of images, and that when the image is carrying a lot of archetypal dominant, it really vibrates, and it's hard for us to take our eyes off it.
But there is a difference if we're going to be really, and I know I'm being a pain in the tail, but just to be precise for a minute, there is a difference between something that's archetypal and mythological in a very strict sense, because, and I remember this from having to study for our exams, myths are stories that are believed to be true by the people who invented them.
Yes.
So, myths are the religious stories of a culture. And so, for example, if you lived in ancient Greece, you actually believed that Aphrodite arose from the sea foam or something, that was sort of taken as fact. And so there, when we think about Star Wars, does it contain mythologems? Does it contain mythological elements? Is it archetypal? Absolutely. It's like such a great example of the monomyth. And it's interesting because we don't for a second believe that Luke Skywalker really existed. And yet it speaks to us with the same intensity. I mean, it's an interesting thing to consider. Like, even though we know it's not true, it still really captures something. And I think that's the archetypal quality. So does it matter whether or not something's a myth or something's mythological or archetypal, or what is the difference? I think if we're gonna be precise, that there is somewhat of a difference there. And maybe it's true that all myth is archetypal, but products that are archetypal are not all myths. Maybe it's something like that.
Or they're not currently in the cultures as a myth in as much as they're real. So, for instance, if we were going to talk about a mythopoetic reality, as many people believe that Christ was alive, is still alive, is still a functioning Godhead that interacts with them in all these multiple ways. So that would put it in the category of a living myth in the moment.
Yes.
But the myth of the hero is still a myth, even if the aesthetic expression of it in a given moment in the culture is not taken as a fact in the moment. And in that regard, we're moving into how Jung used myth, because when he amplified a dream with a mythology, he wasn't suggesting that everything in a dream was thought to be a current reality in the lived sense, but the myth does something psychotherapeutically that he found interesting.
What I'm wondering about is whether we might be circling around a really huge tectonic shift in today's world around myth, which is that it used to be literally true, whether they're Greek myths and Aphrodite arising from the sea foam, or, Hera going after all of the liaisons that her husband Zeus had and wreaking vengeance upon them. And certainly, the whole Christian myth and churches and our 2,000 years of this being a very dominant myth. Versus now, I think the tectonic shift is things are moving inside. we don't have those dominant, overarching, universally,
Those unifying stories, yeah.
right, that we believe that we all believe this is the case. And it's out there, and it's up above, and there's a superordinate reality that presses down on us, that has an objective of existence. We're much more moving into the need to find our own myth and to find it inside ourselves. And because we don't have those superordinate cultural structures that everybody subscribes to, and that's very much Jung. This is a new day is dawning, and we are going to have to find it within.
We're going to have to find our own kind of personal myth, which is an idea I want to return to. But Deb, I'm so glad you went there because if we think about like myths or stories that are believed to be true by the culture that writes them, I would like to offer that the DSM is a cultural myth.
I love that. Okay.
Because that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
It absolutely is a myth.
It is our myth. And we have other myths about like technology, for example. And we believe they're true. Like I have the DSM sitting right over there, and people want insurance reimbursement. I take a code out of there, and that brings me to this is my favorite quote from the collected works. I know you guys already know which one it is. We think we can congratulate ourselves on having already reached such a pinnacle of clarity, imagining that we have left all these phantasmal gods far behind. But what we have left behind are only verbal specters, not the psychic facts that were responsible for the birth of the gods. We are still as much possessed today by autonomous psychic contents as if they were Olympians. Today, they are called phobias, obsessions, and so forth. In a word, neurotic symptoms. The gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus, and produces curious specimens for the doctor's consulting room, or disorders the brain of politicians and journalists who unwittingly let loose psychic epidemics on the world. So, I mean, it could be our belief about what causes mental distress. That's a kind of mythology. We have political mythologies. And we don't even think of them as myths because we assume they're true. So that's just another way of looking at this. Not the only way, but just a way.
Yeah. I think what you just have read is so incredibly important, that the gods of Olympus have become the gods of the solar plexus, and we don't recognize them. That what is the hidden god, if you will, that rules a person's need to have everything in perfect order, perfect tidiness, and we call that, obsessive compulsive disorder, for example. And that something is going on that is archetypal and mythological, but we don't often call it that. We take medication for it.
So we're in the realm of mythic placing, and this kind of depersonalization of certain aspects of our own experience. So as Jungians, we can start with this idea of what's wrong with me, and then through the amplification of myth, then we can ask, where does it belong? And then perhaps broaden the way we think about it. So for instance, if I suffer from a panic disorder, does reading about Pan, from which we get the word, does reading about Pan give us a frame of understanding, metaphors, where we can then understand the forces, the deep psychological forces that surface in my lived experience as a panic attack, and understand that this belongs to an impersonal and abstract aspect of the psyche. And in doing that, does that give us relief? And what I would say is, for some people, but not always, for some people, that shift of perspective gives them breathing room between their waking personality and the phenomena that they are beholding inside themselves. Heaviness can be ascribed to Saturn. Being in a kind of frenzy could be assigned to Dionysus. And if it matches well enough, people can have that aha experience. And often, as I've seen in my practice, people can kind of exhale and place it into a certain aesthetic frame that gives them some distance between themselves and the problem that they're suffering. And many different systems do that, by the way, but myth is one way of possibly doing that.
Yeah, I think it's hugely important, and that was one of Jung's great contributions that was often very much a part of dream interpretation. Exactly what you're saying. Somebody has panic disorder, or, I dreamt of, this is pretty common dream, a dream where you can't get to the place you have to get to take an important test, but you didn't take the course and you can't find the building, of panic. And there is a relief in knowing that there is a deep mythological taproot in Pan, in instinctual life, the god with goat feet and hairy legs, that it relativizes our experience of it's not just me or you having a hard time. It is part of a vast human storehouse that is meaningful and takes us out of our isolation of just our own experiences and our own ego. There's a relief in that. We're not alone. There's a God here. And how do we relate to that God that might be showing up in panic around taking an exam, for example?
So just to kind of amplify what you've both been saying, I have some quotes because I love quotes. Here's one from Liz Green, who's I believe she's a Jungian analyst and also a kind of a mythological astrologer. She is the author of the Mythic tarot, I believe. She says, myth offers us a feeling that the problem may not be a problem. It may be a process. Joseph Campbell said, myth makes a connection between our waking consciousness and the mystery of the universe. So it lets us know where we're located. And similarly, Marion Woodman says, without an understanding of myth, without an understanding of the relationship between destruction and creation, death and rebirth, the individual suffers the mysteries of life as meaningless mayhem alone. So myth saves us from that. Myth lets us know that we're in a mysteriously ordered universe.
Now, I'd love to bring up a hot topic. As Jungians, we are very pro-myth, pro-archetype, the a priori structures, which sits right against and in great tension to the postmodern idea that nothing has inherent meaning, that human beings simply decide what's true and then it becomes true, that there are no eternals, and that everything is up to be treated as an eternally plastic and mutable substance, and that by declaring what my reality is, that it suddenly is in fact reality. It sounds very abstract, but it's a very different philosophy. And these two systems kind of bark at each other, probably mostly in just academic circles, kind of bark at each other, going back and forth about what's more accurate. What I would suggest is that both domains have some validity and are accurate, because how we talk to ourselves about our own experience absolutely influences how we move through the world, the choices we make, how we manage with the difficulties. And there can still be deep, powerful pre-existing structures that are informing that, and that we need both. We need the ego and we need the unconscious to be talking to each other to co-create a functional life.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction, Joseph. And I wanna take us just for a second into another dimension of this that I've always been interested in. And it's an idea that first kind of constellated for me when I was reading Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he talks about that famous scene of Arjuna on the battlefield, which is from the Bhagavad Gita. And Arjuna realizes he's about to enter into this battle and he's going to kill all his kinsmen. And then his charioteer reveals himself as Krishna and reveals to him that it doesn't really matter, that he is a player in the great cosmic drama. And it kind of invites him or demands of him that he lift himself out of his personal perspective. And the god says, I am mighty, world-destroying time, now engaged here in slaying these men. Even without you, all these warriors standing arrayed in the opposing armies shall not live. Therefore, stand up and win glory. Conquer your enemies and enjoy an opulent kingdom. And then Campbell does something with it. I want to read just a sentence or two. Campbell says, the disciple has been blessed with a vision transcending the scope of normal human destiny and amounting to a glimpse of the essential nature of the cosmos, not his personal fate, but the fate of mankind, of life as a whole. The atom and all the solar system has been open to him. And this, in terms of befitting his human understanding, that is to say, in terms of an anthropomorphic vision, the cosmic man. So what I get from that, if you'll just bear with me for a minute, is that we are ordinarily in a kind of a personal frame. We think about our life in terms of, what's happening to us and the impact of us as an individual. We don't go around holding this mythological, cosmological perspective on ourselves and our lives. But this is one of the things that myth does, is it opens up this cosmological perspective. And it's very, very different. What looks incredibly destructive and awful and dangerous when viewed from this standpoint to the ego, if we look at it from the mythological perspective, it's just as it should be. And just one other little example, maybe to try to frame what I'm saying a little bit more. Persephone is raped by Hades. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that she goes through the necessary initiation that looks like a rape from one perspective. From another perspective, it is the necessary thing that has to happen when we lose our innocence. So if we stand on one side of the equation, things look one way. If we can possibly shift into more of a kind of mythological stance, it looks really different.
And I think that's what, overall is what mythology teaches us, is it connects us with that which is beyond, bigger than, deeper than, wider than ego. Of it looks terrible from the standpoint of ego. Oh my God, poor Jonah gets swallowed by the whale. That's terrible. And what about Job? All of the terrible travails that he didn't deserve is awful.
Yes.
And things happen to us in life that are unfair and terrible, and they really are. There's just no way to say it's perfectly okay. But mythology opens us to, there is another perspective beyond me and how I feel, and it connects us with that. Of the, Jonah learns his lesson in the belly of the whale. Job comes away knowing that there is something greater. The whole theme of the night sea journey, of going through these dark periods. And that, I would say, above all, whether it's Arjuna or any of these other mythological characters, or you or me, is what mythology gives us, is you and your your personal life and your ego is not the whole of the reality that you are part of.
Myths offer a multiplicity of meanings, which are actually inherent in our lives, but often, particularly if we're under stress, are very hard for us to tolerate the broadness of possibility. Theology nails it down. This means this. Science has a singleness of meaning. But mythology opens and broadens. So mythology isn't about nailing down facts. It's about opening and creating other possibilities if it's taken in the right way. We also need to cultivate a kind of mythic imagination.
Mm-hmm.
It is true that some Jungians, although we're all trained in mythology, some Jungians don't use much myth or don't have a lot of faith in it. And I certainly saw that in our training and in our colleagues. But I think that that's a shame. That I think that the imagination and the way that the imagination is stimulated by myths and fairy tales and art, for that matter, gives us options that we didn't know that we had.
I think we might want to turn into two mythological themes that we touched on before we started recording that really highlight and amplify this, which is the night sea journey and sacrifice, self-sacrifice. They're ubiquitous, universal, all cultures throughout history. Of what are these two mythological themes teaching us?
We picked these somewhat at random, right? We could have picked others, but these were just two that we had sort of at the ready.
The gods told us.
The gods, right. Okay.
So the night sea journey is like much mythology is connected to the natural world. So if we can imagine ourselves being in a very primordial world and we're watching what we can see with our own eyes, we see the sun mysteriously rising up in the east. It travels over the sky. It seems to disappear. If you live near the water, it looks like it drowns. It goes into the ocean, and then we don't see it, and we don't know what's happened, and we don't know if it's coming back, for that matter. And so one of the earliest mythologies is about what happens to the sun when it disappears. One way of that being described based on the archaeologic evidence is that people believe that the sun traveled along the bottom of the ocean, struggling and battling and trying to find its way back up to the familiar world, which it seems to every morning as it finds its way back up in the east. So many different mythic cycles sit with this, the idea of birth, death, and resurrection, and all the fantasies of what happens when the sun disappears. What's going on under there? And so this term, the Nikia, or the night sea journey of what goes on when the sun is on the bottom of the ocean. So if we take the bottom of the ocean to mean the unconscious or the mysterious parts of ourselves and what we have to struggle with when we are submerged at the deepest levels, we can have some hints about how that has been imagined across antiquity in the stories of Jonah, perhaps Odysseus, Osiris, and maybe many other examples. So let's talk about Jonah.
Well, it's a wonderful teaching tale, a wonderful mythology of, just to recap the sort of essence or facts of the stories. Jonah is asked to go to an Assyrian city. The Assyrians were pretty rough and tumble warrior type people, and God says, get over there and tell them about God, about me. And Jonah says, sort of, hell no, I won't go. I don't like those people. And he goes off in the opposite direction, not toward Nineveh, and gets on a ship sailing away and there are storms and problems, and the ship is threatened with being capsized, and Jonah says, you know what, this is really my fault. I'm the cause. And he says, just throw me overboard. So they do. And our wonderful whale shows up just in time to swallow him. And so there he is in the belly of the whale. Now, I don't think anybody in ancient times took this literally. We all know when we're in a mythological realm. Oh, you guys look skeptical.
I got to tell you, the Old Testament is taken pretty literally by many people now and then.
I don't think anybody really believed that you get thrown overboard and the whale goes, gloom, and then you live down there for 3 days, which is the moon is dark for 3 days. Christ, it took 3 days for Christ to be resurrected. So we have this dark of the moon, the night sea journey, the dark place where we really don't know that everything's going to turn out all right in the end.
We're in the underworld.
We're in the underworld, and there's no guarantee. Hey, don't worry, it'll only last 3 days. You don't know that. And of course, Jonah is basically spit up on the shore right outside Nineveh, goes and talks to the people there. They all welcome what he has to say, and everything does come out well after all. But the night sea journey is that realm of you don't know, and there are no guarantees.
Right. And we might think about that as, living through a terrible depression.
Oh my gosh. And a terrible life misfortune. And we've either had our own night sea journey, or we know people who have. And it is not anything to be taken lightly. The suffering, the confusion, it's really, when it's hard, it's hard.
Now, if we talk about the mythic theme, where does this show up eons later? In the story of Pinocchio.
Oh, yeah.
Pinocchio and Geppetto, swallowed by that whale, trying to survive in this terrible misery. So there's something about the story that wants to be told and retold again and again. Here's another way that the myth can capture us. You guys may help me try to remember this, but it wasn't very long ago where a entrepreneur and inventor had created a personal submarine and had his son on it and one of their top investors. And they went to the bottom of the ocean. It was going to be really exciting, and the entire thing collapsed in on itself, and they perished in that. And we could imagine, I don't know, that the theme of the night sea journey, let's go down to the bottom, let's find out the secret, and let's survive and emerge like the sun triumphantly. But something monstrous was encountered, and they did not survive. But there is still something compelling about wanting to test oneself, because the night sea journey is also part of the heroic journey. That the sun is the first hero that makes it through the bottom of the ocean and gets back and gives us all its warmth and its light, and we can be inspired by it. One might say that had some of those myths been more present in those individuals' minds, maybe they wouldn't have been possessed by it and felt compelled to enact it. And that's the danger.
A mythic night sea journey is very different from the hubris, the pride, the inflation of ego that particular investor, in my opinion, exhibited despite known construction flaws and of challenging his own will and ego and ability to create. They were going to go down and see some of the remains of the Titanic. That was the idea. And that we don't undertake those kinds of things just out of ego and daring and my own personal will. And there's a mythic lesson there too.
So that's a tragic night sea journey that one we might fantasize had kind of captured the imaginations of some number of people. And again, the enactment is dangerous, which goes back to our earlier statement that once the gods or the archetypes or the myths fall out of conscious knowledge, they don't go away. They just become engines that want to live themselves out in human psyche and in human behavior, but we don't know that they're universal, and so we personalize them excessively, enact them, and as myths often tell us, the gods don't generally have a good effect on the lives of humans. Like in the ancient myths, if a god takes an interest in you, something pretty dangerous is likely to happen one way or another.
I think we might be touching on the theme of humility, which is another iteration, perhaps, of the difference between our personal selves and our egos and our lives and what I want and how things should be, and the larger, mysterious, sometimes difficult and dark context in which we all really live. And that if you want to build your own personal submarine and say, I can do it my way, that is what will happen, versus our friend Jonah coming to humility and remorse on board the ship and knowing that he was the cause and that he will subordinate himself for the sake of his fellow sailors and simply the truth of the situation.
But what we're talking about is the relativization of the ego and whether or not the ego stands in relationship to something larger. And that's what a mythological worldview can give us, right? Because myths, again, as Joseph Campbell said, as I read a little while ago, myths let us know where we are in the cosmos, that we're here, that we're a child of the universe, that we belong here, but also that we're tiny. And I think that goes to your point about hubris and humility, Deb. But I just want to say this mythologem of the Night Sea Journey, we've talked about it in kind of, various guises, but it's worth also mentioning that it exists in Egyptian mythology. It's in the story of Christ and what's known as the harrowing of hell, where he descends to the underworld after his crucifixion, but before his resurrection, and probably many, many other instances that we can think about. So it's just the way that these themes, these mythological themes recur, and they mean something similar, and we can use them in our own psychological explorations to amplify what we're going through. So if we're depressed, we might feel comforted knowing that what we're experiencing is our own version of the Night Sea Journey, and we can look at what Jonah went through and what Christ went through and what Odysseus went through when he descended into the underworld with the seer Tiresias and
Job
and Osiris
and Persephone and
right.
Inanna.
Yeah, right. So it can help us place, as you said before, Joseph, our own suffering in this vast archetypal mythological context.
So the study of myth is one of the very practical domains of consideration. I have to say that much of this interest in the classics, myth, folk tales, fairy tales, has fallen out of our educational system. There was a time when studying the classics was expected. You couldn't get out of high school without a strong grounding in the classics. And it is to our detriment that has happened. I think that the collective, just speaking about Western culture, America, there is a demand, and this shows up in a number of ways. The Marvel comic figures are clearly the return of the gods, and barely in modern garb, because they often show up in very mythic ways, interacting with modern culture. And these are powerful archetypal forces. Our kids want figurines. They want to dress like them. And depending on how young you are, Superman, who is Zeus, is very, very real. Wonder Woman, who is the queen of the Amazons, is very, very real when you're a little kid. And the demand to produce these kinds of cultural artifacts of the mythic level of the psyche hasn't gone away.
Mhm.
It's still there. Now, they are considered, as you were saying, Lisa, probably by the little ones, as real, in the same way that all of us, many of us, used to believe that Santa Claus was real. He is a mythic artifact that, I mean, when I was a kid, I prayed to Jesus, Mary, and Santa Claus fervently, and probably more so to Santa Claus because there was some really objective proof that he showed up
Right.
once a year. I mean, that was a living myth for me because I thought it was real, 100% for some time. I had the evidence, but more importantly is I needed it. I needed this myth to organize my psyche in certain dimensions, and it was very important. And they are vestiges of much more complicated mythic cycles, the all beneficent sky father that comes down and gives all good gifts. You know, as the Bible tells us, these things are waiting to be activated. They're waiting to be tickled. And sometimes they can cause a bit of havoc, but often they can save us, actually. Jesus, for some people, might be the mythic image of a masculine who is gentle and kind and self-sacrificing and ever faithful. And if one lives in a world where there is little to no lived evidence of that, Jesus can become very important. If we're in a world where we don't have a mother, or perhaps our mother is alcoholic or drug addicted, and we find our way to a devotion of Mary as the Divine Mother, can have a saving grace to it and is also a universal dominant. Mary is very much like Isis in description, and Osiris is very much like Christ in description. So the archetypal strata of the psyche will activate and often can try to save us and help us when all else is lost.
It's a really interesting and touching point that you're making, which is, what supports us when nothing supports us? Nothing in the external world. When we are on a night sea journey, that there is something, there are forces that do support us when all else is lost. It's deeply resonant, reassuring, and true from stories that we all know from people in the here and now.
And speaking of life-saving things, I'd like to talk about Dream School for a minute.
Great segue.
It was so elegant. It was seamless. It just slid right in. No one was going to notice that, I'm sure. That one of the ways that the archetypes and other unconscious factors come to our aid is every night in our dreaming. That there is a benevolent intelligence, which we call the self, which has its eye on us, our co-navigator, as we describe in our book Dreamwise, that is offering assistance in very subtle and meaningful ways. And the artifacts of that encounter are our remembered dreams. And if we take an interest in them and perhaps learn how to unravel some part of that, the positive effect of the dream can be enhanced. And so we created Dream School, and we hope that you'll take a look at it because we think that it is universally helpful and healing. So today, we're going to interpret a dream just in the same way that you can learn to do in Dream School. Today's dreamer is a 35-year-old male, and he works as a business development manager, and he titles his dream, The Taste of Gold. My son and I are searching for gold. It's dark, probably at night. We are at the entrance to a tunnel which is lined with dry, free-flowing sand. I bring out a long, probing stick which has been specifically designed for finding gold. I send the stick in until I feel the back of the tunnel. I retract the stick and find little specks of gold on it. I bring my tongue to the stick to pull the gold specks off. My son is excited and enters the tunnel to find the source of the gold. A moment later, he runs from the tunnel. I feel sick. He's scared. He then tells me there's a screech owl guarding a cave at the back of the tunnel. I research this owl, I'm not sure how, but find out that it's a haunted owl. For context, he writes, I've been on a significant spiritual journey recently through yoga and meditation, which has been enlightening, but a little intimidating as the father of 2 young boys. The main feelings in the dream for him were adventure, intrigue, and exploration, and he offers a few associations. My eldest son and I live in an area of New Zealand with gold mining tunnels from around the 1800s to 1900s. This sounds like a mythic dream because it's unlikely that haunted owls actually are flying around our yards.
So, I think this dream is it is very mythic, isn't it? And, it's just such an intriguing image that there's gold back there. And he can just touch it and he can just taste it. But when he starts to when his son rushes in, then we find out that there is a guardian at the threshold. There's a guardian keeping watch over this gold. You can't just access it. And so, for me, the key figure is there in the lysis or the resolution of the dream, the owl, or there's kind of a lack of resolution. What the owl sort of stops forward movement, but it's also a very intriguing image, isn't it?
It reminds me of something that Robert Bly says in Iron John, which I think has influenced an entire generation of men, which is, don't show your gold too early in life. And what he means by that is, and we have some examples of sometimes young men or even adolescent boys come into a depth of inspiration, skill, and great talent. And if they try to offer that to the world, maybe monetizing it or developing products from their insight when they're very young, the stress and intensity of engaging the collective or an adult financial entrepreneurial opportunity can be overwhelming and exhausting to the soul. So that sometimes the discovery of what is highly valuable inside of us requires time to grow into ourselves so that we can represent what is precious in ourselves in a muscular and thoughtful way. And so it's okay for the father, the adult, to taste bits of his own gold, to find it and recognize it and extract it. But for his young son to rush in and grab the gold, there is a beneficent dweller on the threshold that says, not no, never, but not now. You don't belong at the gold. You're 3 or 5.
I think it's a great dream about how to access and what is the right relationship with the unconscious, the shadow. And the point of the shadow, Jung says, 99% of the shadow is pure gold. Or we have, where the lotus grows in the mud. We have a lot of images for that. So the father figure, our dream ego, does it with the stick and brings back little bits of gold. They're assimilable. They're digestible. The sun part of our dreamer goes bounding in, recklessly, impulsively, and runs into the screech owl guarding the cave, and it's scary. Of what is the correct approach to shadow, to your unconscious, to bringing things to awareness that has to do with respect and care and a conscious search for what you can really digest and assimilate, rather than bolting in, I'm going to get it all. So in a way, I think you and I, Joseph, have just said pretty much the same thing from, slightly different perspectives.
So speaking of mythology, I want to pick up 2 big images from this dream and riff on them for a minute. So we have gold, which appears in many a myth and fairy tale, and is an image of that which is of highest value. It's incorruptible. In the Aztecs believed that gold was the excrement of the sun. Gold is associated with the sun. It is therefore solar. It shines like the sun. However, you find it in the bowels of the earth. So it's funny because it's both kind of solar and chthonic or earthy at the same time. The owl was sacred to Athena. The screech owl in particular was associated with wisdom and was sacred to Athena. But of course, the owl is also associated with darkness and night, and even Satan in some traditions, the powers of darkness. The owl is also considered to be chthonic in some symbol systems, and that's interesting, right? Because owls are, after all, birds, so they do fly, and yet here they are sort of associated with the earth. So there's a tension with both of those symbols, and in some sense, they're somewhat opposite because, as I said before, the gold is very solar. It is associated with consciousness and sunlight and truth, and the owl is associated with darkness and to a certain extent with the feminine. So there's something here that interests me about, and Joseph, you said that the owl is beneficent, and I agree with you. I think the owl, there is a kind of helpful warning that you need to rest into the darkness. You need to shake hands with the dark feminine, perhaps, that which is chthonic or of the night, before you can fully access this wonderful shining gold.
Yeah. You have to figure out a way to get past the guardian. And it's not by rushing in there. And this is another whole mythological theme of thresholds and guardians. And what does it take to get in the castle or the back of the cave or, whatever the situation is? How do we cross the threshold and make friends with the doorkeeper, the guardian, etc.? And the boy part of the dreamer doesn't know how to do it.
There's also, as you were speaking, this a connection between wisdom and gold. So if the owl is a symbol or associated to wisdom through Athena, the alchemists thought of wisdom and gold being very similar. So there is this connection in the unconscious between wisdom and gold, and leading to the rubedo stage, by the way.
And what a really wonderful dream that absolutely depicts the mythological way in which the dream maker's psyche, the mysterious forces operate. This is what happens. This is simply psychic fact.
So this is a beautiful and wonderful dream for us to be circling around at the end of our talk about myth, which is really just a taste. We hope many of you will just dive right in and revive your interest in mythology and drink it in.
Yeah, see what you dream, see what you draw, see what comes up. Just notice.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.